know, brother, you will not be able to plug in, turn on, and cop out. You will not be able to lose yourself on Skag and skip out for beer during commercials because the revolution will not be televised.
You read the Bible, Brett?
Yes.
Well, there's this passage I got memorized. Sort of fits this occasion. Ezekiel 25:17. The path of the righteous man is beset on all sides by the iniquities of the selfish and the tyranny of evil men. Blessed is he who in the name of charity and goodwill shepherds the weak through the valley of darkness, for he is truly his brother's keeper and the finder of lost children. And I will strike down upon thee with great vengeance and furious anger those who attempt to poison and destroy my brothers. And you will know my name is the Lord when I lay my vengeance upon thee.
So if you've seen the movie, you know how that bit ends. Not well for the Brett in the seat there. So this is probably one of the most famous uses of a Bible verse in the movies, except it's not actually really a use of a Bible verse. It is, however, probably the most famous use of dialogue that sounds like a Bible verse in the movies. What Ezekiel 25:17 actually says is this: "And I will execute great vengeance upon them with furious rebukes, and they shall know that I am the Lord when I shall lay my vengeance upon them." I used the King James Version as I assume that's what Quentin Tarantino was attempting to channel when he wrote his version of Ezekiel 25:17 for Pulp Fiction. And it appears to be biblical, right? Partly because it does use biblical sounding language, and also partly because we're accustomed to the idea that the God of the Old Testament appeared to be very much concerned with vengeance. And we have this idea, don't we, that God says in the Old Testament, "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord." Except he doesn't say that exactly. He does say in Deuteronomy 32:35, "Vengeance is mine, and recompense for the time when the foot shall slip, for the day of their calamity is at hand, and their doom comes swiftly." "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord," is actually from Romans 12:19, which says this: "Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay,' says the Lord." So whether or not you believe that God is indeed a vengeful God, it is not and never has been our place to take revenge for ourselves. And this is what Jesus is talking about in our passage for today. So we're looking at Matthew 5:38 to 42. "You have heard that it was said, 'Eye for eye and tooth for tooth.' But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you." I think that the eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth part of the law has always been a bit misunderstood. It seems to imply that retaliation is somehow mandatory. And this is despite the fact that Leviticus 19:18 says this: "Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." But then later in Leviticus 24:19 to 20, we do read this: "Anyone who injures their neighbor is to be injured in the same manner, fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth." the one who has inflicted the injury must suffer the same injury. So the principle underlying this law is lex talionis, literally law of kind, meaning that there should be justice of equal measure. The idea is that when it comes to compensation for damages, no one has to pay over the amount of the actual damages, but it's not okay to pay less. The law was meant to prevent escalation, to stop violent cycles of revenge. So it was an eye for an eye, not a limb or a life for an eye. There's a scene in the movie The Untouchables, because of course there's a scene in the movie to illustrate my point. However, in The Untouchables, the character of Jim Malone is telling Elliot Ness how to get Al Capone, and he says this. And I won't do the accent, although it's kind of cool because it was Sean Connery. If you want to get Capone, here's how you get him. He pulls a knife, you pull a gun. He sends one of yours to the hospital, you send one of his to the morgue. That's the Chicago way. It's ironic, though, isn't it, that the way they actually brought Al Capone down wasn't through escalating violence, but with charges of tax evasion. But that's a human instinct, isn't it? Not just the Chicago way. Our instinct can be to meet violence with even more violence. Killing sprees in the name of justice or revenge are a common theme in TVs and at the movies. But the law did not allow for that. What it was allowing for was taking responsibility for damages, equality of justice, and making the punishment fit the crime. But then Jesus comes along with his revolutionary ways and gives us 3 illustrations of kingdom living. The first one of which prohibits taking even measured or reasonable retaliation. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. So I'm right-handed like the majority of people. So if I slap someone on their right cheek, I'm backhanding them. They won't get the full force of a slap to their left cheek, as Will Smith demonstrated at the Oscars. And actually, that slap was a perfect example of our imperfect humanity, of a small-minded, vindictive escalation where the response, the punishment, didn't fit the crime. So to return to the passage, a slap to the right cheek is still painful, but it's designed to be really insulting. However, just to be clear, we're not talking about being physically assaulted. It's a slap to the right cheek, not a closed-fisted blow to the face. If you've been assaulted, you're allowed to defend yourself. However, if you are being insulted, Jesus says not only should you not take revenge, you don't even get to take what the law considered fair compensation. This is an idea later expanded by Paul in 1 Corinthians 6-7, when he's talking about believers having lawsuits against each other, which he describes as a defeat for them. And he says to them in the NLT, why not just accept the injustice and leave it at that? Why not let yourselves be cheated? For a disciple, someone living in the light of the kingdom of God, there is no room for retaliation. And furthermore, Jesus just doesn't say we shouldn't retaliate. He says we should also turn the other cheek, which means to offer that cheek to be slapped as well. This is not to say, however, that we are being passive. One writer called W. Wink claimed that for Jesus, Turning the other cheek is non-violent, direct action that he describes as a practical, strategic measure for empowering the oppressed. By turning the other cheek, for example, the victim robs the oppressor of the power to humiliate. The oppressor must decide whether or not to slap the person again, but this time as one would slap an equal. So Wheat contends that turning the cheek seizes the initiative from the oppressor, overcomes fear, and reclaims the power of choice, all while maintaining the humanity of the oppressor. Revolutionary Christian living in a violent world is to not meet violence with more violence. And then in another example, Jesus says this: "And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles." So if a very poor person got themselves into legal trouble, the only thing they could offer as collateral that was worth taking was the shirt off their back. The shirt was not like underwear, but it was worn against the skin under a coat. Now, what the Mosaic law said that you could not actually permanently take someone's coat. Exodus 22:26 says this: "If you take your neighbor's coat as a pledge, return it by sunset, because that cloak is the only covering your neighbor has. What else can they sleep in? When they cry out to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate." So despite the law saying people were allowed to keep their coat or cloak, Jesus says to hand it over. Again, like turning the other cheek, I think what we are seeing here is Jesus suggesting a proactive and provocative response. So imagine a situation where in ancient Israel, a man who is poor and powerless is seized by a merciless creditor who demands his shirt. And not only does this poor debtor give him his shirt, but gives him his coat as well. This would make him naked before the creditor and others, humiliating the creditor as someone who's been harsh and cruel. This response to someone who's been hostile is one that empowers the victim, restoring to them a sense of dignity and lovingly confronting their oppressor, making them acknowledge the evil inherent in a system where the poor had little or no way to remedy wrongs that were done to them. In the next illustration, Jesus gives advice to go 2 miles with someone who forces you to go 1. Now, as you'll be aware, there was a much hated Roman form of exploitation which was in their law, which allowed soldiers to force people to carry things for them, usually their equipment. The most famous incident of this, of course, is Simon of Cyrene being forced to carry Jesus' cross, as recorded in Matthew 27:32. And in this context, Jesus says that if your hated enemy forces you to go in the 1 mile, you should go 2. Jesus says go beyond what the Roman law allowed for, because the law only allowed a soldier to force someone to carry their gear for 1 mile. But Jesus says go a 2nd mile. Going the extra mile is a phrase we use today, which originates from this passage. And in one sense, it actually really diminishes the original intent and power of Jesus' instructions. For us to go the extra mile is to put in a bit more effort to be particularly helpful or kind. Going the extra mile is nothing like being forced by an enemy, oppressor, to carry their gear. So in the revolutionary world of kingdom living, resistance is not non-compliance. It's doing even more than an enemy can ask of you. And finally, Jesus says this in verse 42. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Mosaic law commanded the Jewish people not charge, poor Jewish people at least, interest on loans. So you can imagine perhaps a certain reluctance to help out someone if you felt you weren't going to get anything out of it. And also, giving money was most often used as a means of establishing power over somebody. It created a situation where there was an obligation, a need to reciprocate in some way. Giving was also a means of self-glorification. Later in Matthew 6, verse 2, Jesus says this. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets to be honored by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full. So this illustration may feel a little out of place. However, if you think about it in terms of another power imbalance, like a soldier or an aggressive predator, where someone is exploiting someone else, it actually makes sense. And wealthy Jews, it seems, were taking advantage of their poor neighbors. The land was an ancestral heritage, so it generally wasn't supposed to be put up for sale. But if a poor person defaulted on a loan, those who were already wealthy could acquire the land and even more wealth. An indication of just how prevalent this was is illustrated by the fact that when Jewish rebels revolted against Rome, one of the first acts was to seize and burn all the debt records that were stored in Jerusalem. So for me, in the earlier illustrations, Jesus tells us that if we are being exploited, to respond with love. And this last one, he tells us to not exploit others and to help those who are being exploited. So in our passage this morning, Jesus reaffirms the original intent of the law, that retaliation and revenge belong to God and to God alone. Romans 5:10 in the NLT says this. For since our friendship with God was restored by the death of his Son, while we were still his enemies, we will certainly be saved through the life of his Son. As unrepentant sinners, people who didn't recognize God's claim and sovereignty over our lives, we were enemies of God. And how did God treat us? With compassion, grace, and love. So much love that he sent his Son Jesus to die for us so that we could be reconciled to God. So as God's people, as disciples in his kingdom, our revolutionary act is to treat those who would exploit us, who would do us harm, with the compassion, grace, and love that God showed us. And yes, you could say those people don't deserve our compassion, grace, and love, just as we don't deserve God's. And I think that's the point. Amen.